Okay, guys, this lesson is on the major battles in the Civil War and what states seceded from the Union. Seceded, of course, means to pull away or to leave. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. It's funny, his name wasn't even on the ballot in the South. They didn't even allow his name on the ballot. But if you remember in the last lesson, we talked about how in the North there were 31 million people, and in the South there were 12 million, with 3.5 of those million being enslaved. Well, so even without Lincoln's name being on the ballot in the South, they had enough people voting in the North that he was elected president. About a month after he was elected president, the first state, South Carolina, seceded or left the Union. In South Carolina, off of the coast of Charleston, there is a federal fort. It's in the water. It's called Fort Sumter. Well, Fort Sumter was a federal fort, so there were Union soldiers in it. As soon as South Carolina seceded, they thought that the Union soldiers should leave because it's not part of the Union anymore. So they began firing on the Confederate Army, began firing on Fort Sumter to get those Union Army guys out of there. They're trying to say, look, South Carolina is not part of the Union anymore, so you all have to leave. The firing lasted for about 3 days. It started on April 12th, 1861, and no one was killed in the shooting back and forth. But the Union soldiers began to run out of supplies, and they ended up vacating the fort. That is what started the Civil War, the fighting, and that was April 12th, 1861. A couple months later, July 21st, 1861, was the first Battle of Manassas. Well, as we know, Manassas is in Northern Virginia. So why did the battles happen where they happened? They happened for many reasons. One reason was to control the capitals. The capital of the Union was Washington, D.C. The capital of the South was Richmond, Virginia. Very close to each other. So if you controlled that area, you had both capitals. Also, they wanted to control the waterways. Manassas is on the Potomac, so that's controlling the waterways. Why did they want to control the waterways? Because they shipped soldiers and goods by water. They also wanted to control the high grounds. So a lot of the battles took place as each side tried to get to the highest spots at key locations. Obviously, if you're higher, you can see down, you can see what's coming at you. So those are the three reasons why battles took place, where they did. The first battle of Bull Run, or Manassas, there are going to be two there. The first one was very interesting. No one that was alive in 1861 had really ever seen a war. The Revolutionary War was over 100 years before, so nobody had ever really seen a war. So picnickers from D.C. went up and laid their picnic baskets out and were ready to see the Union Army crush the Confederate soldiers very quickly. When the fighting started and the Union soldiers started firing on the Confederacy, the Confederate soldiers let out what they call a rebel yell, more like a yell that you would hear from Indians when they were attacking, and they charged towards the Union soldiers. The Union soldiers turned around, retreated, ran up the embankment, through the picnickers, all the carriages that were laid out. People were trying to get out of the area like crazy. There was a traffic jam, if you can imagine that, with horse and buggies. And it was just crazy. The people in the Union really thought that we're going to show up to this battle. It's going to be fun. We're going to watch it. It's going to end quickly. The Civil War is going to be over. That's not what happened. The first battle of Bull Run ended up being a victory for the Confederacy because the Union soldiers retreated. So it was a Southern victory. The next thing we need to talk about is the Emancipation Proclamation. President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd, 1862. And what it said is, look, if you don't free all your slaves by July 1st, January 1st, 1863, if you don't come back into the Union by January 1st, 1863, then I'm freeing all your slaves. Okay, well, as we know, the South needed their slaves for the economy. The only thing is people were like, wow, President Lincoln, that's great that you can say that, but you're not our president because we don't belong to the Union, so we don't have to listen to anything you say. The Emancipation Proclamation is going to be a big deal when these states apply to come back into the Union after the Civil War is over. They have to actually rewrite their state constitution and make slavery illegal. So even though it didn't free slaves in the Confederacy on January 1st, 1863, the process was there and it was starting. And many freed African Americans joined the Union Army to help fight so that their friends, family, people still enslaved in the South would be free. The Battle of Vicksburg, Mississippi, which is right on the Mississippi River, was a huge defeat of Southern troops. By taking control of the Mississippi River, which was a waterway, one of the goals, the Union Army was able to essentially cut the Confederate Army in half. Half of them were on one side of the Mississippi River and half on the other, and they were basically cut off from one another. It's funny, in Vicksburg, Mississippi, the town was so angry about losing this battle that they didn't celebrate Independence Day for almost 100 years after the Civil War was over. They were still so angry about it. But they do celebrate it today. That's just kind of one of those weird little trivia facts. And that battle took place from March to July 1863. So it was a very long battle. People starved to death. Townsfolk, there were no supplies able to get into the city. You could imagine the city was decimated with bombs, a cannon fire. People moved into caves in the mountains to get some shelter. It was an awful few months for those people. July 1863 was the Battle of Gettysburg. This was actually the turning point of the war. Robert E. Lee, the general for the Southern Army of the Confederacy, went up to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Their men were supposedly getting, their uniforms, their shoes had worn out, so a bunch of them were in the town of Gettysburg trying to find new shoes, get new shoes. And this 3-day battle took place. It's the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. It took place over 3 days. The bloodiest day was Antietam, but Gettysburg was the bloodiest battle, and it took place over 3 days. The Union Army ended up sending Robert E. Lee and his troops south, and they came back into Virginia. This was going to be the last of the fighting in the North. Please go to the History Channel and do some research on any of these battles. They've got those great videos. If you can get a hold of America, the History of Us, that DVD series that we were making our way through, and watch these chapters on the Civil War or episodes on the Civil War, you will really enjoy them. Finally, on April 9th, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant, which is the Union general at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. You have to understand that these guys were buddies before the war. They knew each other. They had gone to school together, so they had much respect for each other. There was nothing at this sit-down where they were angry with one another. They knew both were good generals, and it was time to put the country back together. Robert E. Lee even said to the Southerners, please, I've surrendered, the war is over. Now it's time to come back together. We can't harbor hatred. We have to come together as a nation. So he was instrumental in helping to put the country back together. And on our next lesson, that's one of the major things we're going to talk about is the key people in the Civil War, and Robert E. Lee is definitely one of them. I put together a packet for you that I put on View and the classroom website, and it starts with this, chapter 28, and you can read all about these battles that I just talked about. Also, one of the things that I needed to go over with you was what state seceded from the Union. I'm going to flip my camera around and show you, or try to show you, a poster or a picture of the United States. Now, the green states are the states that stayed in the Union. The yellow states are border states. There were 5 border states. So we have Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. They're southern states, but they're also border states. Then Virginia on down to Florida, over to Texas, all those reddish, orangish states seceded from the Union. That was the Confederacy. You can see this blank space in the middle. Those were still territories. They were not states yet. And then you have California and Oregon out in the west. They were states of the Union. They did not secede from the Union. Okay, so all these states, Texas, Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Florida, Arkansas, Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, and the border states had to apply to come back into the Union after the war. And one of the steps of doing that was to declare slavery illegal in your state. I hope that this lesson gave you a little snippet of the Civil War. Very, very important war. We learned a lot of stuff about people and about our country during this war. Like I said in the email, I usually teach this unit in 5 to 6 weeks, so teaching it in 2 small lessons is hard. But I hope that you learned a little bit today. You guys have a great weekend. We have 1 more week to go with this distance learning. Stay safe, and I miss you very much. Bye.